Hi, everybody. I want to welcome all the listeners and the viewers for another episode of Hashing Out the Law. On this episode, I have a guest who I previously had on last season, Steve Schwartz. Steve conducts LSAT classes and helps people who want to take the LSAT. I wanted to have him on today to discuss what's happening with the coronavirus and the LSAT. So the LSAT, because of all the lockdowns and all the at stay-at-home orders, has come up with something called the LSAT-Flex. Hi, Steve. How are you?
Hey, Raj. I'm good. Thanks for having me back on. Great to connect.
Great having you back on, Steve. So, Steve, let's just dive right into it. This LSAT-Flex. Tell us a little bit about this. I know you brought it to my attention. Obviously, I'm not going to take the LSAT, so I haven't been following it. But because it's your area of expertise, what is the LSAT-Flex and how did it come into being?
Yeah, sure. So the LSAT-Flex is a new online LSAT put out by the Law School Admission Council. They really had to do it because they couldn't administer the LSAT in person. The March LSAT was canceled due to coronavirus. The April LSAT had to be canceled as well due to coronavirus. And who knows how long this thing is going to go on. Applicants still want to take the LSAT and go to law school. Law schools still need applicants. And so they've created this new at-home LSAT you can do online. And so it's a couple of big changes related to it. First off, it's a shorter exam, 3 sections, not 5, and students are being monitored by a proctor remotely via webcam and microphone. So it's a very different experience.
So I was going to ask you that, but you answered the question. There is somebody that's going to be proctoring it and making sure you don't cheat, you don't have your notes and things like that, correct?
Exactly, for security purposes. And the funny thing is that it's hard to cheat on the LSAT because it's not a memorization test. There's not a whole lot of formulas, not a lot of information. So it would be of limited usefulness anyway. But just to be safe, to ensure the validity and integrity of the exam, they've got to do something, and that's what they do.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question. I don't know if you know the answer to it or not, but how are they going to do that? And is it going to be each person is going to have one monitor or one person in charge of monitoring everybody? How is that going to be done?
So they have rescheduled the LSAT from late April to being mid to late May. So there's going to be about 18,000 people, 18,000 people registered for this LSAT Flex. But if they were all taking it on the same day, not at the same time, not enough proctors. And so they're going to be spread out on different days at different times. And I assume that one proctor might monitor 15 people at once. Their screen could be divided into little squares with mini versions of each student. And they're also recording it for later. They also have what they call AI monitoring of the student's workspace and even tracking their eye movements. And so anything suspicious might get flagged if the student is looking away or crouching down out of field for a moment, then that'll be flagged for later proctor review after the fact. So they are recording the students as well in case of anything.
That's actually very, very interesting, not just on an LSAT level, but on the technology level. It seems like it's the zenith of technology used for taking a test, recording people's eye movements and things like that. That's very interesting. How long do you think this is going to happen? Do you think, and second part of my question, do you think this will remain even after all this Corona stuff is over?
That's a great question. I've thought a lot about that. Based on my reading of the coronavirus situation, I think this could go on for months. The June LSAT is scheduled for June 8th, but a lot of stay-at-home orders, including California, are until June 10th, as far as the last I heard. So I don't see any way that the June LSAT could go forward in person. I think that will be another LSAT Flex. And then the more times they administer it, the better they get at doing so. And I also see it being hard to go back on technology. If this is more convenient and if there are second and third waves of coronavirus, this may be with us for months on and off. They've got to be able to do more LSAT Flex administrations. And then there are people in far-flung areas of the world who have to take airline flights and stay in hotels and drive long distances just to take the LSAT. And this removes all of those logistical barriers. And so I don't see them going back on it. They're taking it one day at a time, it seems, over at the Law School Admission Council. And so they're not making any commitments. But long-term, I do think this will be the new way to administer the LSAT.
Do you think eventually they'll have, you know, how they have on the bar where you can actually use a computer or you can actually do it handwritten? Do you think they're going to have the regular LSAT where you walk into a room and there's tables, old school way, and at the same time have the LSAT-Flex, or is it all going to streamline into one of those things?
In the short term, they might do in person for one administration, online for another based on the coronavirus situation. But over time, I think that gets too complicated for them. Even for the in-person LSAT now, they've got to have all these tablets, like thousands of LSAT of tablets to proctor the LSAT digital in person. That's been a nightmare. They've had tech issues with those. They weren't charged properly. They couldn't get them to the test center in time due to some logistical hiccup of sorts. And this removes all of that. And I think it's a lot of effort for them to administer any LSAT, whether in person or online. And the more options they provide for different formats, the more complicated it gets. And so I think long term, they're not going to do it with both options. They're just going to stick with one. And since the online is something that everybody can do all the time, with a few exceptions we could talk about, I think they're going to stick with the online.
Wow. So let's backtrack a little bit. When I took the LSAT, we were in a room with a Scantron and number 2 pencils. From what you were saying right now, they have tablets. You can actually take it digitally. Is that what's happening?
Yeah. So starting last year in North America, they transitioned to a digital format, still 5 sections, same timing, same number of questions and such, but just on a tablet with a touch screen rather than the old school paper and pencil. This latest change brings that digital system online. But one thing we should also talk about is that because it's online, due to the proctoring limitations, they can't have an exam more than 3 hours. How do you handle bathroom breaks? It's not a controlled environment like a testing center. And so they cut it off after 3 sections. You're doing 3 sections, back to back, no break, then you're done. Whereas with the old LSAT, you'd have a break and then do 2 more sections. So it's a very different test day experience.
Yeah, it certainly is. Now, you said something about exceptions. What are the exceptions you were talking about?
Well, in certain cases, accommodated test takers, the digital format might not suit them well. So for example, blind or visually impaired test takers, they might need special assistance to take the LSAT. In the past, they might have a proctor assist them in reading the questions. That they haven't built that into the digital system that I've seen. So that particular case might require an in-person administration. Also, there are cases where a student, an applicant, might not have a device that's suitable for the online LSAT. They're saying you've got to have a laptop that's Windows or Mac. A Chromebook is not suitable. A tablet is not suitable, ironically enough, given that the old format was tablet, and you can't do it on your phone. So if somebody does not own a device that they could take the online LSAT on, they've got to contact LSAC. LSAC will probably provide them with a loaner device and maybe even a site where they can take it. Obviously tough under quarantine, but LSAC may have to either ship people a suitable device as a loaner or connect them with a university, for example, that could provide them with a device and the proctoring.
I see. So you got to have a certain device. You can't just do it on your phone and things like that. That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for the people who had already registered in the old ways, are they going to just transition them into this new one? Do they have to re-register? How would they go about doing that? And if you haven't registered yet, how do you do that?
So this LSAT-Flex for May specifically is not an open registration. Not anybody can take it. This is mainly meant to be a short-term measure to help out students who were going to take the April LSAT and no longer could due to it being canceled and changed into LSAT-Flex. So those people specifically are the ones who have the option to do LSAT-Flex if they've been auto-registered for it, but they can opt out if they don't want to do it. They can instead get a coupon good for any LSAT until April 2021. And if none of those works for them, I'm sure they could ask for a refund. But in the future, the June LSAT, if that's canceled, which I think it will be, that might become another LSAT-Flex, in which case more people would be able to take that. And down the line, we'll see what happens.
I see. So the one that's coming up in May is for people who had already registered. They were going to take the April one, but it got canceled, so they can do that. So it's not open registration. And if the June gets canceled, you think that it will be open registration and people can register to take it?
I think depends on the numbers. LSAT can only accommodate so many people for something that they're doing for the first time. So my expectation is that anybody who registers for June, if and when that's canceled, that will become another LSAT-Flex for the June takers, maybe not June 8th as initially planned, maybe late June, early July. So if you want to do LSAT-Flex, I would say register for June, and you've got a good shot at being turned into an LSAT-Flex.
I see. Okay. That makes perfect sense. This is very interesting. Even though I'm not going to take the LSAT, the whole concept of it is very interesting to me. Now, if you are taking the LSAT-Flex, what do you need to know?
Well, again, 3 sections back to back, not 5. So if you've been preparing for an in-person LSAT with 5 sections, a much longer experience, and you've been simulating being at a testing center with other students who could distract you, proctors who could distract you, maybe some proctoring issues potentially, all of that's removed. And it's a much more pleasant experience to do it at home in a comfortable environment that is hopefully quiet with few distractions. All you really need is the buy-in of your roommates, family, significant other, pets to not get in the way for those 2 hours. And you've got to have a good internet connection. So I think it's a more pleasant day. It's also a shorter test day. So that's really nice. I would just say make sure that you're preparing at the same desk with the same device you'll be doing the actual online LSAT for. Make sure your internet connection is good, and choose a time that works for you. They're going to give you options for presumably morning, afternoon, certain days of the week. And so pick what you think will be least likely to be interrupted and go smoothly.
Now, let me ask you this. In your opinion, do you think if you've been studying and practicing and preparing for the old system, 5 sections, all the descriptions, and now you're going to do this, do you think it's an advantage or a disadvantage? Now, I understand it depends on the person, but in general, what's your opinion about that?
I think overall, it's a much more favorable environment to take the LSAT, to do it in the comfort of your own home. And as for switching the style of preparation, they've given a good amount of lead time relative to what they could have done. I mean, they announced this about a week ago, and the LSAT-Flex will be mid to late May. So they're giving you well over a month to adapt your preparation accordingly. So if you do a timed exam or 2 per week, you should be in good shape. And if you were doing 5 sections and now you're doing only 3, if anything, it's like you've been training for a marathon and now you're doing a half marathon. Should be a breeze compared to what you were initially planning on. So I think it'll be easier and more favorable. A slight difference to be aware of is that, like I said, 3 sections, not 5, and that the 5 would have been 4 scored sections plus 1 experimental. Now it's 3 scored sections, no experimental. Instead of doing 2 logical reasoning sections, you're doing only 1 logical reasoning section. So logical reasoning may have less importance, or they may double its weighting. We'll see what happens. LSAC should hopefully announce that soon. But each logical reasoning question that you do might have double the weight, or alternatively, games and reading comp might have relatively more importance. And so be ready for anything. Hopefully they'll tell us more. They've got a webinar happening tomorrow, Wednesday, as time of recording now. So hopefully they'll share more information on it.
That actually, what you were saying leads me to my other questions, that it segments into that. I was going to ask you, for the people who are not familiar with the LSAT, or like myself, haven't taken it for a long time, there's the logical reasoning, there's the reading comprehension, and what's the third one?
The logic games.
The logic game. So now, before you had 5 sections, you knew you were going to get at least 1 of each, and then 2 of the other ones you could guess. But now you know you're going to get 1 of each section, correct?
Yeah, so initially you were going to have 1 games, 1 reading comprehension, 2 logical reasonings, and 1 experimental of any of those 3 types. Now it's only going to be 1 logic games, 1 logical reasoning, and 1 reading comprehension, period.
Right. And then you touched this a little bit, but is how the sections are going to be, we don't know how they're going to be scored yet, or do we know? Is one section going to be scored more than the other? What do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, that's something that's an open question. We don't know. Previously, since 1991, you've had 2 logical reasonings scored, which were half the exam. So logical reasoning had more importance than the others. It was 20, 25, 25, 50. Now it's maybe a third, or maybe they're doubling logical reasoning's importance, even though it's only 1 section. We don't know. As for what do I think it could go either way. If they want to be more in line with what's happened up to this point, they would double the weighting of logical reasoning. But back in the 1980s, there were only 3 sections and each one had equal weight. So I could see them going either way on this.
Okay. So there is precedent where there's only 3 sections and they were all scored equally.
Exactly. And regardless of which way they go on this, LSAC will still give students a scaled score out of 180, even though they're only going to have approximately 75 questions as a raw score, rather than the typical approximately 100. So it'll be considered equally by admissions as any other LSAT score, even though the conversion is going to be a little bit different.
Now let's talk about the option to cancel your score. I remember when I took it, you had the option to cancel your score before the score came out. Is that something that's still available? And if it is available, can that be done with the LSAT-Flex?
Yeah, you can still cancel your score, but what they typically do, as they're doing in this case as well, is you cannot see your score before deciding whether to cancel. So given that law schools do not average multiple scores and rather only take the highest, there's not really a reason to cancel your score. You wouldn't want to accidentally cancel a score that ended up being a very good one. And if it's not so great, you can always retake and they'll only consider the highest score anyway for admissions purposes.
I see. Okay, that makes perfect sense. Anything that we missed or anything else you want to talk about with this new LSAT-Flex?
Not in particular. I would just say to students that although obviously it's a format change, the style of delivery is a little bit different. The content of the exam has not changed at all. All the previous exams you've been using to study are still perfectly relevant. All you've got to do is change your test day prep specifically in terms of the length of the exam and the environment in which you're taking it. And I'll be updating students through all my channels, the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel, the LSAT Unplugged Facebook group, the podcast, the Instagram, as well as the LSAT blog. I'm spending all day, every day thinking about this and how to prep students accordingly. And so anyone listening or watching can certainly feel free to reach out.
Awesome. I was actually going to say, please tell everybody about your different channels. Steve is an LSAT expert. I haven't taken an LSAT in years, but every time I talk to Steve, he teaches me information and talks to me about the LSAT. And if I was going to take it, he's the person I would want to talk to. So make sure you guys check out Steve's podcast, his YouTube channel, his Instagram, and we'll make sure to put all those links on here. Also, you can see Steve on a previous episode of our podcast. I think it's season 1, episode 17, where he talks about the LSAT. All his links are also on there. Steve, every time I talk to you, I learn something new. And I really, truly mean that. You are an expert when it comes to the LSAT. Thank you for coming on and explaining this LSAT-Flex. I had heard about it through you, but I had no clue what was going on. Now, anybody asks me what it is, I can definitely tell them what it is. Thank you, Steve. I hope you stay safe. I know you're in the epicenter. You're in New York. I hope you and your family and everybody in this country goes through this and comes out safe. Anything else about the LSAT, Steve, that you want the listeners or the viewers to know?
That's pretty much it for now, but thank you so much for having me. Always a pleasure to connect with you.
Thanks, Steve. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.